We've all seen the flawless, glamorous magazine spreads of old Hollywood's most iconic couples. But behind the perfectly staged honeymoon photos and million-dollar smiles, a much darker reality was playing out. For some of the biggest stars in the world, marriage wasn't a romantic milestone, it was a frantic survival strategy. Forced by ruthless studio contracts and terrifying moral clauses, these celebrities used wedding bands as human camouflage. They shared homes and lived entire lives as a performance. But what happens when the cameras finally stop rolling and you're trapped in a script you never wanted to write? Number 1. Rock Hudson and Phyllis Gates. In the fall of 1955, Universal Pictures didn't just host a wedding. They executed a crisis management operation. At the center of it was Rock Hudson, the studio's most bankable asset, and Phyllis Gates, a woman who conveniently worked as his agent's secretary. To understand the sheer panic behind this union, you have to look at how the studio system valued its properties. Hudson was the ultimate mid-century American heartthrob. His entire box office appeal was tied to a very specific brand of rugged, accessible masculinity. But behind the closed doors of executive offices, there was a fire to put out. The notorious tabloid Confidential was preparing to publish an exposé that threatened to completely dismantle Hudson's carefully engineered public image. The studio's response was swift and heavily calculated. Hudson's agent, the formidable Henry Wilson, effectively traded damaging information about his other clients just to kill the Hudson story. Yet, temporarily silencing a magazine wasn't enough to secure Universal's long-term investment. They needed a permanent, visible shield. In that era, a marriage certificate was the most airtight PR strategy available. The psychological weight of this arrangement is what makes it so suffocating. For Hudson, stepping off a film set didn't mean he could stop acting. The marriage required him to perform his leading man persona 24 hours a day, extending the contractual performance into his own living room. He was effectively trapped by the exact image that made him rich. The situation with Phyllis Gates adds a layer of quiet tragedy, though her actual awareness remains a subject of historical debate. She maintained until the end of her life that she believed it was a genuine courtship feeling profoundly betrayed when the relationship inevitably unraveled. Many industry historians argue it's highly unlikely an insider working directly for Henry Wilson could be completely blind to the studio's machinery, but we cannot know for sure. What is clear is that she functioned as a necessary prop in a corporate defense strategy. When their divorce was finalized 3 years later, the immediate threat to Hudson's career had passed. Universal kept its superstar intact. The executives successfully protected a major financial asset, leaving the actual people involved to navigate the lingering fallout of a marriage built entirely on fear and studio dictates. Number 2. Rudolph Valentino and Jean Acker. The ultimate on-screen seducer of the 1920s spent his wedding night alone, pounding on a locked hotel room door. Rudolph Valentino was heavily marketed to millions as the Latin lover, a man whose sheer magnetism supposedly made women faint in the theater aisles. Yet the reality of his 1919 marriage to actress Jean Acker stands as a glaring contradiction to everything the early film industry wanted the public to believe. Long before the major studios perfected the art of the long-term, heavily managed PR marriage, Valentino and Acker attempted their own, rather clumsy version of a protective shield. Valentino was facing intense pressure to project a stable traditional masculinity that aligned with his massive box office draw. His private life, marked by early legal troubles and associations that simply didn't fit the matinee idol mold, was increasingly viewed as a liability. Acker, meanwhile, was deeply embedded in Hollywood's discreet underground circles, specifically moving within the orbit of the powerful actress Alla Nazimova. Both actors needed a respectable conventional cover story to survive in an industry that was rapidly beginning to police the morality of its stars. Their solution was a hasty wedding that collapsed almost as quickly as it was arranged. When Acker locked Valentino out of their suite at the Hollywood Hotel just hours after exchanging vows, she wasn't just ending a relationship. She was exposing the fragile, improvised nature of these early industry illusions. This arrangement lacked the heavy-handed corporate enforcement that would characterize studio-mandated marriages decades later. They were simply two young performers trying to navigate the crushing social expectations of fame without a sophisticated crisis management team to force them to keep up the act. The fallout was a messy, highly publicized divorce that required Valentino to legally admit on record that they had never even lived together. It's a fascinating historical moment because it highlights the sheer panic of early Hollywood. The film business was demanding its stars embody impossible romantic fantasies, but the studios hadn't quite figured out how to completely control them off-camera. Valentino retained his immense stardom, but the brief union remained a humiliating reminder of the widening gap between the flawless conqueror on film and the cornered man trying to purchase a little social safety with a fake wedding ring. Number 3. Alla Nazimova and Charles Bryant. For more than a decade, silent film icon Alla Nazimova and British actor Charles Bryant were celebrated in the press as one of Hollywood's most devoted couples. There was just one minor detail the public missed: they were never actually married. Unlike the later generations of actors who were bullied into weddings by studio executives, Nazimova engineered her own illusion. At the height of her fame in the early 1920s, she was pulling in an astronomical salary and wielding unprecedented creative control. But she also understood the increasingly puritanical expectations of the American audience. To protect her career and her private reality, she simply announced to the press that she had married Bryant, intentionally bypassing a legal ceremony altogether. Bryant was the perfect societal shield. He was handsome, accommodating, and willing to play the role of the supportive husband on red carpets and in glossy magazine spreads. This verbal arrangement bought Nazimova something incredibly rare in early Hollywood: a private sanctuary. Behind the high walls of her sprawling estate on Sunset Boulevard, which she later converted into the famous Garden of Allah Hotel, she cultivated a vibrant, discreet haven for the industry's underground LGBTQ circles. Her fabricated marriage was the lock on the gate that kept the moral policing of the outside world at bay. But relying on another human being as a permanent prop comes with inherent risks. Bryant wasn't just an obedient studio employee. He was an actor whose own identity was entirely eclipsed by Nazimova's massive shadow. After years of playing the phantom husband, he abruptly ended the arrangement in 1925 to legally marry a wealthy socialite, leaving Nazimova to deal with the media fallout. His sudden departure forced a humiliating public admission from the actress that her long-standing domestic life had been a complete fiction. Yet her strategy left a permanent mark on the business. Nazimova essentially invented the blueprint for the Hollywood cover marriage. She proved that a carefully constructed domestic illusion could buy a star years of personal freedom, a tactic the major studios watched, learned from, and would eventually weaponize against their own contract players. Number 4. Janet Gaynor and Adrian. In 1939, Hollywood's original Girl Next Door eloped with the man responsible for dressing its most glamorous vamps. Janet Gaynor, the first woman to ever win an Academy Award for Best Actress, and Adrian MGM's reigning king of costume design, might have looked like an odd pairing on paper. Yet their union represents something completely different from the panicked, forced arrangements usually orchestrated by studio executives. This was not a crisis. It was a masterclass in mutual preservation. By the late 1930s, both Gaynor and Adrian were navigating a rigid industry that heavily policed the personal lives of its top-tier talent. Gaynor's entire box office value rested on her wholesome, unblemished sweetheart persona. Adrian, on the other hand, operated in a glass bubble of brilliant eccentricity. As the man who designed the ruby slippers for the Wizard of Oz and the sharp-shouldered suits for Joan Crawford, his immense value to the studio afforded him a certain level of tolerance. But as the decade closed, both of them understood a fundamental truth in Hollywood: no one's protection was permanent without a conventional domestic cover. Their decision to marry wasn't a desperate reaction to an impending tabloid scandal. It appears to have been a proactive, highly civilized defense strategy. By merging their public profiles, they built an impenetrable social fortress. They provided each other with the exact picture-perfect marriage the American public demanded, efficiently shutting down any industry whispers about their respective private realities before those rumors could ever threaten their careers. What sets their story apart from the typical casualties of the studio system is the profound respect that seemed to anchor the arrangement. They didn't just sign a legal document to satisfy their bosses and then live entirely separate lives. They shared a home, raised a son together, and remained married until Adrian's death 20 years later. Instead of letting the corporate machinery dictate their survival, Gaynor and Adrian played the industry's ultimate game on their own terms. They gave the system the illusion it required, and in exchange they bought themselves the one thing that was almost impossible to find in mid-century Hollywood: the freedom to be left alone. Number 5. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester. For 33 years, Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester shared a home of profession and a closely guarded understanding that their marriage was fundamentally different from the one they sold to the press. Lanchester didn't discover her husband's private reality through a tabloid sting or a studio executive's panicked phone call. She learned it directly from Laughton himself shortly after they wed in 1929. Laughton was an actor of immense heavy talent, famously known for playing tormented larger-than-life figures like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Behind the camera, he carried a crushing internal guilt regarding his attraction to men. The film industry of the 1930s and 40s offered no space for someone like him to exist openly, without facing complete professional ruin and severe legal consequences. He was terrified of exposure, and his marriage became his primary defense mechanism against a hostile world. Lanchester's reaction to his confession shaped the rest of their lives. Instead of demanding a quiet divorce or fleeing back to England, she chose to stay. What emerged wasn't a cold corporate strategy dictated by a studio boss, but a highly personal civilized pact of mutual protection. For Lanchester, the marriage provided stability, deep intellectual companionship, and a secure place within the Hollywood elite. For Laughton, it offered an impenetrable shield, allowing him to navigate the studio system without the constant paralyzing fear of being outed. However, playing the role of a lifelong shield came with an emotional cost. In her later memoirs, Lanchester openly acknowledged the profound loneliness that sometimes accompanied their arrangement, noting the inevitable distance between them when Laughton pursued discreet relationships away from home. Their domestic life required a significant amount of compromise and unspoken boundaries. Yet, to simply label their union a fake marriage would be a disservice to the genuine bond they shared. They worked together, navigated the treacherous waters of the studio era together, and cared for each other until Laughton's death in 1962. Their story stands as a complex reality of the era, an arrangement born out of societal necessity sustained not by romantic passion, but by a profound, enduring friendship that the industry forced them to disguise as a traditional marriage. Number 6. Tyrone Power and Annabella. In the late 1930s, 20th Century Fox treated Tyrone Power like a priceless asset that required constant environmental control. As the studio's top leading man, his entire box office value was built on an uncompromising heterosexual magnetism. When whispers about his private life began circulating among studio executives and gossip circles, the studio didn't wait for a crisis to break. They engineered a marriage. The solution arrived in the form of Annabella, a French actress already established in European cinema. Darryl F. Zanuck, the powerful head of Fox, heavily promoted their 1939 wedding as the ultimate fairy tale romance of the era. Fan magazines were flooded with glossy spreads of the glamorous couple, carefully designed to project an image of domestic bliss and traditional stability. For the studio, the marriage was a strategic marketing investment meant to permanently neutralize any disruptive rumors before they could touch his films. Yet the day-to-day reality of this studio-backed union was far removed from the headlines. Power and Annabella found themselves locked into a public contract where their private choices were perpetually managed by corporate stakeholders. While Annabella maintained her own career, the marriage largely functioned as an administrative shield, keeping the studio's financial interest safe from moral scrutiny. The emotional toll of living behind a corporate-approved facade eventually wore them down. As World War II drew power away into military service and the pressures of their manufactured public image mounted, the relationship quietly frayed. They divorced in 1948 after nearly a decade of living out a script written entirely by studio publicists. Their story highlights a specific cruelty of the studio system, the way actors were expected to perform domesticity as a condition of employment. Power remained a bankable star, but the price was surrendering his personal autonomy to a machinery that treated marriage as nothing more than a profitable public relations maneuver. Number 7. Cary Grant and Barbara Hutton. For years, Cary Grant shared a Santa Monica beach house with fellow actor Randolph Scott. The studio publicity departments enthusiastically framed the living arrangement for the fan magazines as two handsome bachelors simply enjoying the California lifestyle. But inside the executive suites, there was a growing anxiety about exactly how long the public would buy that innocent narrative. Grant was the ultimate cinematic invention. He had completely erased his working-class British origins to become the absolute standard of mid-century sophistication. His career was built on an effortless, flawless charm, but that charm required the right framing to remain commercially viable. By the early 1940s, the industry whispers regarding his private life and his remarkably close bond with Scott were becoming too loud for the studios to comfortably ignore. Grant needed a narrative shift. He found it in 1942 when he married Barbara Hutton, the heiress to the Woolworth fortune and one of the wealthiest women in the world. The press eagerly dubbed them Cash and Cary, treating the union as a glamorous collision of Hollywood royalty and American aristocracy. Yet underneath the flashing cameras, this relationship functioned as a highly effective mutual buffer against public scrutiny. Hutton was exhausted by a relentless media that constantly monitored her every move and heavily critiqued her previous relationships. Grant offered her a steady, charming presence who didn't need a single cent of her fortune. In return, Hutton provided Grant with the ultimate social credential. Marrying a high society heiress immediately grounded his suave, detached persona in conventional domesticity. The wedding effectively neutralized the industry rumors overnight, redirecting the tabloid focus from who he shared a house with to how much money his new wife possessed. The marriage only lasted 3 years, dissolving quietly without any dramatic scandal or financial disputes. While biographers continue to debate the exact nature of their private affections, the functional outcome of their union is clear. They provided each other with a temporary luxurious fortress. For Grant, it was a masterful stroke of public relations, proving that sometimes the best way to protect a private reality is to step directly into the brightest spotlight available. Number 8. Judy Garland and Vincente Minnelli. On the set of Meet Me in St. Louis, MGM didn't just capture cinematic magic, they facilitated a union that served two vastly different purposes for the people involved. When Judy Garland married her director Vincente Minnelli in 1945, the studio publicity department immediately went to work packaging them as Hollywood's ultimate creative partnership. But behind the glossy magazine features of their domestic life, this was a deeply asymmetrical arrangement. Vincente Minnelli had arrived in Hollywood from the New York theater scene, where his relationships with men were an open secret. In the rigid, morally policed environment of 1940s Los Angeles, however, that reality was a direct threat to his career. Marrying the studio's most beloved female star provided him with an unimpeachable social cover. It was the ultimate shield against the strict moral clauses embedded in every MGM contract. The problem was the immense psychological toll this arrangement took on Garland. Unlike the civilized, mutually understood pacts made by some of their peers, Garland was not looking for a corporate alliance or a PR strategy. She was a deeply exhausted, overworked young woman searching for genuine stability to anchor her highly pressured life. Instead, she found herself in a marriage where she was effectively functioning as human camouflage. The executives at MGM were perfectly content to look the other way. They had secured their brilliant director behind a veneer of traditional family life and temporarily placated their increasingly exhausted star. The studio's corporate machinery treated the marriage as a convenient fix for two separate liabilities, completely disregarding the human element. As the years passed, the pressure of maintaining this uneven dynamic became impossible to sustain. Garland's well-documented struggles with emotional distress and the relentless demands of her schedule only intensified the fractures in their home. They eventually divorced after 6 years. Their time together remains a stark illustration of how the studio system's demand for conventional imagery often carried a devastating personal cost. For Minnelli, the marriage functioned as a necessary professional armor, but for Garland it was just one more exhausting role she was expected to play behind closed doors. Number 9. Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor. In the spring of 1939, an executive order came down directly from the most powerful desk in Hollywood. Louis B. Mayer, the absolute ruler of MGM, did not suggest that his two highly profitable stars settle down. He summoned Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor to his office and essentially informed them that they were getting married. At the time, Stanwyck was one of the highest-paid women in America, known for her fierce independence and a private circle that included many prominent, discreetly gay women. Taylor was the studio's impossibly handsome leading man, whose flawless features often led the press to question his traditional ruggedness. Independently, their private realities were becoming a massive headache for the MGM publicity department. Together, however, they represented the perfect corporate merger. The studio's logic was ruthlessly efficient. A wedding would instantly neutralize the whispers surrounding both of them, locking down two major box office draws behind a single, unassailable wall of domestic respectability. They were given a manufactured wedding timeline sent off on a heavily publicized honeymoon and quickly established on a sprawling California ranch. What makes their situation so fascinating is how they managed this forced compliance. Unlike the deeply strained dynamic of other studio arrangements, Stanwyck and Taylor approached their mandated union with the pragmatic discipline of working professionals. They functioned more like friendly roommates and business partners than a traditional couple. They rode horses, hosted the right industry dinners, and smiled for the cameras exactly when the fan magazines needed a new feature on Hollywood's ideal marriage. This arrangement held together for over a decade. By the time they finally divorced in 1951, both actors had aged past the intense, hyper-managed scrutiny of their early careers. The marriage was never a grand romance, but it executed its primary function flawlessly. It allowed Stanwyck and Taylor to continue working at the absolute top of their field, proving that under the studio system, the most effective way to keep your real life a secret was to simply let your boss cast you in the role of a happily married spouse. Number 10. Van Johnson and Evie Wynn. In early 1947, MGM didn't just orchestrate a wedding to protect a star's public image, they actively dismantled an existing family to do it. The marriage between Van Johnson and Evie Wynn stands as the most ruthless, heavily documented example of corporate crisis management in the history of the studio system. At the time, Van Johnson was MGM's ultimate boy next door, a massive revenue generator whose entire appeal relied on an uncomplicated, thoroughly American charm. However, industry rumors regarding his private life were accelerating, threatening to become a severe financial liability for the studio. The executives needed a permanent PR shield, and they found a brutally efficient solution. The plan required Johnson to marry Evie, a woman who was already married to his closest friend, fellow MGM actor Keenan Wynn. Under immense pressure from the studio brass, an astonishing logistical maneuver took place. Evie finalized her divorce from Keenan, and within mere hours of the decree, she married Johnson. The publicity department spun the narrative flawlessly. By marrying his best friend's ex-wife, Johnson was instantly recast in the fan magazines not as a liability, but as the winner of a dramatic, highly marketable love triangle. The rumors evaporated overnight, replaced by a steady stream of domestic photo ops. Yet the human cost of this transaction was staggering. Evie was effectively utilized as a transferable corporate asset reassigned from one contract player to another to protect a multi-million-dollar investment. For Johnson, the marriage secured his standing as a leading man, but it locked him into a profoundly complicated domestic reality, engineered entirely by his employers. All three individuals were expected to maintain a public facade of amicable acceptance, smiling for the cameras while living inside a corporate compromise. The Johnsons remained married for over 2 decades long after the iron grip of the studio system had crumbled. When they finally divorced in the late 1960s, the executives who forced the arrangement were long gone. The marriage remains a chilling endpoint to the golden age of Hollywood, proving that at the height of their power, the studios viewed the actual lives of their stars as nothing more than raw material to be edited, spliced, and rewritten to keep the box office safe.